So about 5 years ago, I'm helping renovate a house from the 1800s in Colorado. I'd remove a piece off the wall and not know what century the dust was from. The homeowner, a man named Richie Molitor, told me I needed to cover my face. He said, there have been rats in here and there's a virus that you could get. It's actually the first time that I learned about the Hantavirus. I miss Richie. He also taught me how to say realtor because I was always saying realtor. And he was like, it's not doctor, it's doctor. Well, he explained to me that rodents carry the virus and that it gets into their droppings. And then when you disrupt the environment, especially in old sealed up spaces, you could inhale particles and that could cause a respiratory illness with a brutal fatality rate. So I put on a respirator and I didn't think about hantavirus again until 2 days ago. My brother texts the group chat with a TikTok panicking about the next pandemic, and I immediately thought, no, I actually know about this thing from researching it years ago, and it's not something that can spread from person to person. I was wrong. This was a different hantavirus. Question is, how bad is it? In North America, the main strain of this is called sin nombre virus. I don't know if I'm saying that right. It causes what's known as hantavirus pulmonary syndrome, or HPS. And that's where the lungs essentially start filling with fluid. There's no specific cure, and that's why Richie was so stern with me about covering my face up. The fatality rate with people who develop breathing symptoms from it is about 38%. To put that into perspective, COVID had an estimated fatality rate between 0.1% and around 5%, depending on what time frame you were looking at. Actually, it was over 5% at times. The average people talk about now is like 1% overall for global COVID-related fatalities. And that was as of April 2023. So yes, hantavirus is deadly, but the key thing I had in my head is it does not spread between people. You would have to get it from the environment that you're in, from rodents. No person coughing on you could possibly infect you. That's why my initial response to the TikTok about the cruise ship was there's probably rats on board or something, and that infected a few people. But what I didn't know is that there's more than one type of hantavirus. The Andes virus, which I'm learning about now for the first time, is what was responsible for the cruise ship outbreak. And its ability to spread between people has been confirmed in previous outbreaks going back to the late 1990s in Argentina. For it to spread, you'd typically need close, prolonged contact, like sharing a living space with someone who's symptomatic. So the story of the cruise ship, which had 100 and something passengers on it, had one man on board with the virus. His symptoms developed on April 6th, and he passed away on the 11th, just 5 days later, still on board. But the ship kept going, and a lady started feeling bad. She died on the 26th. Since then, there have been 9 confirmed cases and 3 deaths. People from the ship have touched multiple continents. The World Health Organization, or the WHO, has activated its international health regulations response protocols. They've started quarantining some people and have literally been hunting down passengers from the original cruise. I was reading the British military parachuted onto a remote island looking for one passenger who had disembarked from the ship there. So it's being treated as a serious, active health event going on right now. But based on what I've been reading, I'd say don't panic, and here's why. The incubation period for the Andes virus can stretch up to 42 days, which means cases that were exposed before the ship even docked may not have shown symptoms yet. The WHO has already said publicly that additional cases are possible. But additional cases are possible is not remotely the same thing as saying it could be a pandemic. The hype and fear on TikTok just is news doing what news does. When you feel yourself getting pulled into that anxiety spiral, here are things worth actually holding on to. The WHO's current global risk assessment is low. Andes virus human-to-human transmission has been documented for decades, and in every previous outbreak, spread has remained limited to people in close, prolonged contact with a symptomatic individual. It has never triggered exponential community spread the way that a respiratory virus can. And the international response has been very quick and coordinated. Now, if you're following because you'd like to know how an event like this could affect your portfolio, I want to be upfront with you about something. This is actually my professional lane. I'm a fee-only financial advisor making YouTube videos. And I'm just gonna tell you what the data shows. Because every time a story like this breaks, I see people either completely ignoring it, and I think it's best to be informed, or I see people make reactive decisions based on panic. And I think it's better to think and respond rationally rather than panic. Now, historical market behavior is not indicative of future results, and past performance is no guarantee of future returns. With that said, I have collected a few quick examples from history. First one is in 1918, there was the Spanish flu. It's the worst pandemic in modern recorded history. Researchers who've gone back and modeled the stock market data from that period found a severe negative correlation between market performance and the death rate. Meaning when deaths spiked, markets fell right in lockstep with that. The market was essentially repricing economic activity in real time based on how deadly the outbreak was. Those economic shockwaves extended from 1918 all the way into 1920. That's not a blip. That's a sustained repricing event driven entirely by a biological shock. Next example's in 2003. There was the SARS virus. This was a completely different story, and in terms of broad US impact, SARS barely registered. It stayed largely contained in parts of Asia and Canada. And while specific sectors, airlines, hotels, Asian-facing tourism, took real hits, the major indices recovered relatively quickly. The reason SARS didn't crater markets the way the flu did in 1918 comes down to one word: containment. The economic mechanism that markets are really pricing is not the virus itself. It's the disruption of human economic activity that the virus causes. If you can contain the virus, you can contain the disruption. And finally, there was COVID-19. Researchers who analyzed stock market data going back to 1900, that's over 1,000 separate single-day market moves of more than 2.5%. They found that COVID-19 news was the overwhelming driver of market collapsing in early 2020. The volatility that we were seeing in the market was the highest since the late 1920s and early 1930s. The S&P 500 dropped roughly 34% in 33 days. It's one of the fastest crashers on record. Now, legally speaking, the S&P 500 is an unmanaged index and you can't invest directly into it. However, many investors use ETFs or mutual funds that track this index. Just keep in mind that those funds often have expenses or other advisory and management fees involved. You want to be aware of the net performance after calculating those fees. And here's the part that investors always find surprising. COVID recovered to pre-pandemic highs in approximately 5 months. 2020 ended up for the year. If you had panic sold in March of 2020, and many people did, you locked in losses and then missed one of the sharpest recoveries in market history. That is the single most expensive behavioral mistake I see in my practice. And it shows up predictably during exactly this kind of news cycle. So as an advisor, here's how I frame outbreak risk for a general audience. There's transmissibility, or how efficiently the thing spreads. And so far, the Andes virus doesn't seem to check that box. There's the duration of uncertainty, or another way to say it is how many days does the market have to price in a worst case scenario before it gets some clarity. Known bad news gets priced in and the market moves on, while unknown bad news creates extended volatility. And we have decades worth of research on the Andes virus. And then there's sector concentration, where with COVID, broad index funds took a hit and then recovered. But concentrated exposure to travel, hospitality, and cruise lines did not recover nearly as quickly or as fully. While it's true that there's no way to know what will happen tomorrow, my conclusion based on history is that big events like a pandemic are emotionally intense, and in the majority of cases, shorter lived than it feels in the moment. The investors who fared best through COVID and through every major market disruption that I've observed when I'm studying weren't the ones who had the fastest reaction time, as if they had a crystal ball to know when to sell out and when to buy back in, and no one has that. The best were the ones who had a pre-established strategy before the headlines hit and stuck to their logic when everyone else was panicking. You know, when I put that respirator on in the old Colorado house 5 years ago, I didn't think for a second I would be making a video about these topics years later. And I find this stuff fascinating and a little bit humbling because the things I think I know are sometimes the things that catch me off guard. If you made it this far, thank you. Seriously, this is my first video in this format and I'm still figuring out what this channel is going to be. But I know it's going to involve more stories like this one and more moments where something's in the news and I want to actually understand it, not just react to it. Hit subscribe if that sounds like something you're into, and I'll have a new video up for you next week. See you then.